Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight we are not strolling through marble temples or admiring serene statues in museums. Instead, we are stepping into the myths behind them. Stories where gods castrate their fathers, devour their children, and punish mortals not for wickedness, but for the simple mistake of existing in the wrong way. Before we descend into this gallery of divine absurdities, do me one small favour. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you'd prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. I've linked my favourite pair in the description. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. Now, lie back, get comfortable, let's begin. When most people think of the Greek gods, the images that come to mind are serene. White marble statues with impossibly smooth features, gilded temples glowing under the Mediterranean sun, Renaissance paintings that present Olympus as a place of harmony, light, and eternal wisdom. To the casual eye, the gods appear majestic, the ideal figures of a civilization that prized beauty and order. They are remembered as dignified rulers of the cosmos, immortal figures whose power was tempered by grandeur and composure. It is a fine illusion, carefully polished by centuries of art and nostalgia. The actual myths, however, tell a very different story. Strip away the polished marble, and you find not timeless wisdom, but a litany of grotesque violence, absurd cruelty, and the kind of petty squabbles one might expect from a particularly unstable household. These gods, who were supposed to represent the order of the universe, spent their time betraying one another, punishing mortals for trivial slights, and indulging whims that could collapse kingdoms. One moment, they were seducing mortals in the form of bulls, swans, or the occasional golden rain. The next, they were unleashing plagues, earthquakes, or storms because someone had dared to look at them for too long. To call them moral guides would be rather generous. They were closer to chaotic despots who happened to live forever. For the mortals who worshipped them, this was not an abstract problem. The gods were unpredictable, vindictive, and thoroughly uninterested in the concept of fairness. To live under their gaze was to accept that life might collapse at any moment through no fault of your own. Perhaps you forgot a sacrifice, or perhaps you simply had the misfortune of catching the eye of Zeus. Either way, the myths make it clear that mercy was never the point. These were not benevolent protectors guiding humanity to higher ideals. They were powerful, capricious figures, and mortals existed at best as pawns, at worst as collateral damage. And so the question lingers. How did such figures come to rule the cosmos? How did violence, lust, and pettiness become enshrined as divine order? The answer lies not in the temples of polished stone, but in the raw, violent origins of the pantheon itself. The story of the Greek gods does not begin with dignity or majesty. It begins with chaos, with a yawning void in which the first primordial forces took shape. From this came Gaia, the earth itself, fertile and enduring, and Uranus, the sky, vast and oppressive. The two were joined, not romantically so much as functionally, producing a brood of divine children who would later be known as the Titans. Yet Uranus was hardly the nurturing type. He found his children monstrous and detested their presence, so he did what any caring father of cosmic proportions might do. He shoved them back into Gaia's womb, imprisoning them deep within her body. This was less a metaphor for parental repression and more a grotesque reminder that from the very beginning, Greek mythology was unbothered by the line between creation and cruelty. Gaia groaned under the weight of these trapped children, suffocating within her own flesh until at last she resolved to act. It was not, of course, Uranus's children who took initiative. Most of them were understandably reluctant to wage war against their father, given that he could cover the entire cosmos with his presence. But one son, Cronus, stepped forward. With Gaia's encouragement, he ambushed Uranus. Armed with a sickle fashioned from flint, Cronus struck at the moment his father descended to lie with Gaia once more. The blow was decisive and grotesque. Cronus castrated Uranus, flinging the severed genitals into the sea, where the blood and foam would later give birth to Aphrodite. Few religious traditions can boast that their goddess of love emerged from a floating mass of divine afterbirth, but Greek myth was never concerned with politeness. From the very beginning, the sacred was indistinguishable from the gruesome. With Uranus mutilated and dethroned, Cronus assumed power. Yet, if one expected him to be a gentler ruler than his father, disappointment followed swiftly. Cronus had learned a very particular lesson from this bloody coup. Power is tenuous, and children cannot be trusted. After all, he had just overthrown his own father. Why should he believe that his children would not one day rise against him? Paranoia became his defining feature, a paranoia he chose to address in a manner that was, even by mythological standards, unusually revolting. Whenever his wife, Rhea, bore him a child, Cronus made a habit of swallowing it whole. He did not discriminate. Whether it was Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, or Poseidon, each infant was swallowed alive, disappearing into the cavern of his gut, imprisoned in the darkness of their father's stomach. The image of the king of the cosmos devouring his own children is perhaps the perfect emblem of the Greek divine imagination. Power was not a gift to be cherished, nor a sacred trust to be preserved. It was a constant threat, something so fragile that it required acts of violence to maintain. Cronus's solution was simultaneously effective and horrifying. No child could grow up to overthrow him if they were already trapped within his body. Yet this act was no guarantee of peace. His wife Rhea, despaired as child after child, vanished into Cronus's maw, leaving her with the anguish of both motherhood and futility. The myths do not spare sympathy for Rhea, but one can imagine the relentless despair of seeing every newborn seized and consumed, condemned to a half-life inside their father's belly. Eventually, desperation drove Rhea to deception. When she bore her next child, Zeus, she resolved that this one would not be devoured. With Gaia's help, she hid the infant in a cave on the island of Crete, placing him in the care of nymphs and attendants. In place of her son, she swaddled a stone in cloth and presented it to Cronus. The king, apparently not a particularly observant eater, swallowed the stone without question, satisfied that he had once again secured his power. Thus Zeus grew in secret, nourished by the milk of a divine goat and shielded by the clamour of armed dancers, who clashed their weapons together so that Cronus would not hear his cries. The future ruler of Olympus began his life not in glory but in concealment, nurtured in shadows, while his siblings languished within their father's gut. Zeus did not remain hidden forever. As he grew, he became a symbol of rebellion, though not a rebellion grounded in justice so much as in the continuation of divine family politics. He confronted Cronus with a demand that was both personal and cosmic: release the swallowed children. Depending on the version of the myth, Zeus either forced his father to vomit them up with the help of a potion, or sliced open Cronus's belly to liberate them. Either way, the scene was not one of gentle reconciliation, but of grotesque reversal, a regurgitation of gods who had been trapped for years within the digestive tract of their own father. One by one, the Olympians emerged fully grown and none the worse for wear, as though gestation in the stomach of a paranoid tyrant was merely an extended holiday. The newly freed gods wasted little time in declaring war. They had, after all, an understandable grievance. The Titanomachy, the great war between the Olympians, led by Zeus and the Titans loyal to Cronus, shook the cosmos. This was not a war of ideals. It was not fought for justice, freedom, or principle. It was, in essence, a family feud of divine proportions, waged with the fury of old grievances and the determination not to be re-swallowed. The battlefield was the very fabric of the universe, with mountains hurled like stones and thunderbolts flashing like artillery. The Titans fought with all the strength of their ancient might, but Zeus wielded new weapons, lightning and thunder, cosmic forces that gave him the edge. Eventually, the Olympians triumphed. Cronus and his loyal Titans were defeated and cast into Tartarus, the abyssal prison deep beneath the earth, guarded by monstrous beings. Zeus emerged as the ruler of a new order, his siblings elevated alongside him as the Olympian gods. It was ostensibly a revolution, the overthrow of tyranny and the establishment of a new divine regime. Yet in truth, very little had changed. The cycle of violence, paranoia, and pettiness that had characterized Uranus and Cronus would continue, merely wearing new faces. The king who replaced them was no less flawed, and his reign would prove just as riddled with betrayal and cruelty. The so-called birth of the pantheon, then, was less a heroic origin story than a catalogue of grotesque family dysfunction. From the beginning, divine authority was linked not with wisdom or benevolence, but with violence, mutilation, and cannibalism. To look back on the smooth marble statues or the soaring columns of temples is to see a false veneer laid over a foundation of blood. These were not gods born of harmony, but of revolt. Their claim to power was rooted in betrayal, and their legitimacy secured by acts that would horrify any mortal household. Yet in the world of myth, this was not only acceptable, it was inevitable. And so the cosmos fell under the rule of Zeus and his siblings, a regime born not of justice, but of survival, established on the corpses and regurgitated forms of their predecessors. If the mortals who later built temples in their honour imagined that such gods offered stability, they were sorely mistaken. When the myths tell us that Zeus rose to power after overthrowing his father, there is a faint suggestion that a new order had been established. The time of chaos was over, the cycle of mutilation and child swallowing concluded, and a proper king now sat upon the throne of Olympus. At least, that is the polished version you might imagine if you stopped reading after the Titanomachy. The reality, as the stories make plain, is that Zeus was not a wise king nor a just ruler, but rather a walking catalogue of poor decisions, whose reign was defined by lust, vanity, and an endless inability to leave anything well enough alone. His thunderbolts may have terrified mortals, but his appetites did far more damage than his storms. One of the defining features of Zeus in myth is his inability to remain faithful to his wife, Hera, or indeed to remain uninterested in anyone who happened to cross his path. This was not the behaviour of a king carefully governing the cosmos, but of an immortal who treated the world as a personal playground for his urges. The myths do not even attempt to disguise the absurdity of his methods. When he desired Europa, he transformed himself into a bull, a disguise that raises more questions than it answers. The sight of a magnificent animal drew her in, and Zeus promptly carried her off across the sea to Crete. In another story, he approached Leda in the form of a swan, an image so bizarre that it became a favourite for Renaissance painters, who appeared to find nothing troubling in the idea of a god seducing mortals while masquerading as barnyard wildlife. And of course there is the famous tale of Danae, visited by Zeus as a shower of gold, a transformation that shows both his creativity and his sheer disregard for mortal dignity. For the Greeks, these were not charming tales of romance. They were warnings, reminders that the gods could cross any boundary at any time, leaving ruin in their wake. These stories are, of course, myths, but they reflect a deep unease. The Greeks told them not because they admired Zeus's conduct, but because they recognized in him the dangerous reality of power. It is arbitrary, unrestrained, and more often destructive than protective. When Zeus descended upon a mortal household in one form or another, the outcome was rarely joy. Women were left isolated, shamed, or punished, while children born of such encounters were fated for misery. The very act of attracting the king of the gods' attention was, in mythic logic, closer to a curse than a blessing. Far from being honoured, the mortals involved were dragged into divine family politics, condemned to suffering because of one god's inability to exercise restraint. Zeus's behaviour did not simply disrupt mortal lives, it poisoned the harmony of Olympus itself. His wife Hera was hardly a forgiving partner. Myth after myth portrays her consumed with rage at her husband's infidelities, yet unable to touch him directly, for he was the king of gods. Instead, her fury fell upon the mortals who had been entangled with him, or the children born of those unions. Thus, Zeus's lust was not a private indulgence, but the spark that ignited cycles of persecution and revenge that scarred families and communities. The so-called order he brought to the cosmos was in fact a household in permanent crisis, one in which Hera's anger and Zeus's appetites ensured there was no peace, only constant reprisal. Beyond his affairs, Zeus also revealed himself to be a meddler in human affairs on a grand scale. Mortals might have preferred if their divine king remained aloof, letting them get on with their lives, but Zeus could not resist interference. He was the god of thunder, the wielder of lightning, and the supposed protector of kings and laws. Yet he often appeared less like a dignified overseer and more like an overbearing relative who constantly inserts himself into disputes. When heroes sought to establish their reputations, Zeus was there, either granting them temporary favour or throwing obstacles in their path. When cities rose or fell, his whims played as much a role as human effort. And when mortals dared to display ambition or pride, Zeus was quick to crush them, not out of justice, but out of fear that someone might rival divine supremacy. One of the clearest examples is the myth of Prometheus, the titan who stole fire to give to humanity. This was not, from Zeus's perspective, a noble gesture, but an act of defiance against his authority. In response, he condemned Prometheus to eternal torment, chained to a rock while an eagle tore out his liver each day, only for it to grow back at night. As for humanity, Zeus punished them not with gratitude for their new tool, but with Pandora, the mythical first woman, whose jar of misfortunes unleashed sickness, toil, and death upon the world. The message was clear. Zeus did not grant blessings willingly. Every gift was laced with punishment, every advancement counterbalanced with misery. To live under his rule was to accept that nothing came without a price. Even in the myths of justice, Zeus appears inconsistent. He was hailed as the guardian of oaths and hospitality, yet he himself violated trust whenever it suited him. He punished mortals for breaking sacred customs, yet ignored the very principles he claimed to uphold. In this way, Zeus embodies not the ideal of law, but its hypocrisy. Power enforces rules only on those beneath it, never on itself. For the Greeks, this inconsistency may have been frustrating, but it was also familiar. They lived in societies where rulers often acted in precisely the same way, demanding loyalty while indulging their own vices. Zeus was divine not because he was different from human rulers, but because he was infinitely worse. The myths do occasionally depict Zeus acting with grandeur. He was the wielder of thunder, the enforcer of cosmic boundaries, the one who maintained the fragile order of the world. Yet even here, the stories betray unease. His thunderbolts, symbols of divine authority, were less tools of justice than instruments of intimidation. Mortals feared the sky not only because of storms, but because the storm was thought to be Zeus himself, lashing out with destructive force. To explain a lightning strike as divine punishment was not comforting. It was an admission that life could be snuffed out arbitrarily, with no appeal, no mercy, and no reason beyond the anger of the one who ruled Olympus. If one lived in ancient Greece and offered sacrifices to Zeus, it was not because he inspired devotion, but because ignoring him was far too dangerous. It was out of fear. His altars were heaped with offerings, not because mortals believed him benevolent, but because they hoped to avoid his attention. Worship was a form of insurance, a desperate bargain to keep the king of the gods from destroying crops, striking homes, or bringing disaster. Unlike later traditions that framed worship as devotion, Greek religion often resembled appeasement, and Zeus was the most dangerous figure of all to ignore. In every sense, he ruled by fear, and fear alone. The irony is that in attempting to secure order, Zeus created chaos. His affairs destabilized Olympus. His punishments destabilized humanity. His thunderbolts destabilized the natural world. Far from the majestic ruler depicted in later art, he was a figure who could never control his impulses, and whose interventions always seemed to leave destruction behind. If his reign is remembered as a golden age, it is only because the stories of his predecessors were worse. Compared to mutilation and child swallowing, Zeus's habits may have looked like improvements. Yet measured on their own terms, they reveal a king who could neither manage his household nor govern the world without endless disruption. And so, the supposed king of gods and men presided over an Olympus defined by infidelity, paranoia, and meddling. Mortals who looked to him found no moral compass, only the shifting winds of a ruler's desires. His reign was not a triumph of justice, but a continuation of the same dysfunction that had always governed divine affairs. And in this chaos, another figure emerges, one whose character is impossible to separate from Zeus's failures. If Zeus was the king of Olympus, then Hera was its queen, though the title brought her little satisfaction. In myth, she is described as majestic, the goddess of marriage, family, and queenship, but the stories rarely portray her as serene. Instead, she appears as a figure consumed by indignation, forever locked in battle with the humiliations inflicted upon her by her husband. One might imagine that the queen of the gods, second only to Zeus himself, would enjoy authority, dignity, and reverence. What she actually received was betrayal after betrayal, public shame, and the cruel knowledge that she could never unseat her unfaithful husband. Hera's myths read less like tales of majesty and more like the chronicle of a woman condemned to live in an endless cycle of injury and retaliation. Her identity defined by her attempts to punish those who crossed her, even when those offenders were merely mortals caught in the crossfire. The most striking feature of Hera's stories is not her power, but her powerlessness. She was the goddess of marriage, yet she was trapped in the most dysfunctional union imaginable. Zeus's affairs were notorious, impossible to conceal, and impossible to prevent, and Hera could not strike directly at him. Instead, her rage was diverted onto the mortals who happened to attract his attention, or onto the children who resulted from his encounters. This displacement of vengeance is what made her one of the most feared figures in mythology. To be noticed by Zeus was unfortunate enough. To then draw the hatred of Hera was to guarantee a lifetime of misery. She became less a protective mother goddess and more an emblem of divine bitterness, turning her attention upon those who had no means of resisting her. The myth of Io offers a clear example. Io was a mortal priestess of Hera, a woman who had committed no crime other than catching Zeus's wandering eye. When Hera discovered Zeus's interest, she moved to punish the girl rather than her husband. Zeus, in a rather feeble attempt at concealment, transformed Io into a cow. This disguise did not fool Hera in the slightest, and she immediately claimed the cow as her own and set the many-eyed monster Argus to guard it. From that point on, Io was condemned to a miserable existence, stripped of her human form, tormented by Hera's watchfulness. Even when Hermes, acting on Zeus's orders, slew Argus and freed Io, Hera found new ways to prolong her suffering. She sent a gadfly to torment the girl endlessly, driving her to wander the earth in madness and pain. Here is the central irony. Io was Hera's priestess, supposedly under her protection. Yet devotion was no shield against divine jealousy. In the logic of myth, to serve Hera was no guarantee of mercy. Heracles, the most famous of Zeus's illegitimate children, was also one of Hera's most enduring targets. From the moment of his birth, she marked him as an enemy, and not because of his deeds, but because his existence was an insult to her. She sent serpents to strangle him in his cradle, a dramatic attempt that failed only because the infant possessed prodigious strength. Later, when Heracles grew to adulthood, Hera struck him with a madness that drove him to kill his own wife and children, a crime that set him on the path of his famous labours. Each of those labours was, in many versions of the myth, manipulated or complicated by Hera, who sought to ensure that Heracles would fail, or at least suffer miserably. Far from being a hero celebrated for his courage, he was a man tormented by a goddess whose wrath would never abate. His greatness was forged not by opportunity, but by persecution. If the Greeks told his story to inspire, they also told it to remind themselves that greatness was born out of cruelty as much as out of divine favour. Semele, another mortal woman, fared no better. She was beloved of Zeus, and this alone sealed her fate. Hera, in disguise, befriended the young woman and convinced her to demand that Zeus reveal himself in his true divine form. The trick was fatal. No mortal could survive the sight of Zeus's full radiance, and Semele was incinerated where she stood. From her ashes, the unborn child Dionysus was preserved, though even his survival was strange and uncertain. Later versions of the myth insisted that Zeus sewed him into his own thigh until the boy was ready to be born, a second, stranger birth for a god whose life would be nothing if not unconventional. Hera's vengeance was not careful or restrained. It was absolute, and it left mortals with little chance of survival. What these myths reveal is that Hera's reputation as the goddess of marriage was laced with bitter irony. She presided over the institution, but her own marriage was a public disaster. She was the goddess of family, yet she made war upon children. She was meant to embody the stability of the household, yet her presence in a story almost always signalled conflict, revenge, and destruction. Prayers to Hera were not inspired by affection, but by desperation, an attempt to bribe her into overlooking them as she carried out her vendettas. Devotion was an attempt to ward off her malice, to bribe her into overlooking them as she carried out her vendettas. In this sense, Hera reflected a grim truth about ancient life. The home was not always a sanctuary, and the family was not always a shield. Just as human households could be torn apart by jealousy, resentment, and violence, so too was the divine household on Olympus. It would be easy to condemn Hera as vindictive, cruel, and unjust. Certainly, the myths portray her in such terms. Yet one cannot help but detect an undercurrent of sympathy in these stories. Hera was trapped in a marriage she could not escape, bound to a husband who humiliated her, openly and repeatedly. Her anger had no outlet other than the weak, and while this made her terrifying, it also made her pitiable. The Greeks did not admire her, but they recognized the logic of her rage. She was a goddess who mirrored the worst realities of their world. Women trapped in marriages to domineering men, families shattered by infidelity, and the powerless lashing out wherever they could. Hera's cruelty was divine in scale, but human in its origin. The larger consequence of Hera's wrath was that mortals could never rely on divine justice. To offend her was to suffer, regardless of guilt or innocence. To be noticed by Zeus was to risk becoming her enemy, even if you had no choice in the matter. The gods did not play fair, and Hera's behaviour underscored this with brutal clarity. Worship was not about morality or fairness. It was about survival in a cosmos governed by figures whose grudges outlived generations. The Greeks did not tell these stories because they thought their gods were admirable. They told them because they understood, all too well, that life itself was arbitrary, ruled by forces beyond human control, where punishment often had nothing to do with wrongdoing. In the end, Hera stands as the embodiment of divine pettiness, her myths circling endlessly around the theme of jealousy without resolution. Mortals in her orbit were condemned not because they had sinned, but because the king of the gods had chosen them, and the queen of the gods could not forgive them. If Zeus's rule brought chaos, Hera ensured that the chaos spread, seeping into every corner of mortal existence. She made it clear that the gods were not protectors. They were participants in endless feuds, dragging humanity along for the ride. From here, the pattern of divine cruelty only widened. Hera's vendettas were personal, born of humiliation and betrayal, but other gods demonstrated violence of a more impersonal kind. Destruction unleashed not on individuals, but on whole landscapes, whole cities, whole seas. To understand that wider elemental danger, one need only turn from the queen of petty revenge to her brother-in-law Poseidon, whose wrath was measured not in personal grudges, but in earthquakes, floods, and storms that reminded mortals their entire world was fragile beneath his trident. In the grand hierarchy of the Greek pantheon, Poseidon occupied a role of immense power and constant menace. If Zeus ruled the skies and Olympus itself, Poseidon claimed dominion over the sea, the restless waters that surrounded and defined the Greek world. He was also the master of earthquakes, his trident striking the earth with tremors that could topple walls and swallow cities. On paper, this combination of domains made him indispensable, a god whose control over land and sea should have guaranteed respect. In practice, the myths portray Poseidon less as a dignified ruler than as a volatile figure whose moods could drown the sailors, flatten villages, and condemn mortals to years of suffering. If Zeus was unpredictable in his lusts, Poseidon was unpredictable in his violence. To cross him, whether intentionally or by accident, was to invite storms, curses, and disasters of geological scale. The Greeks, of course, understood the danger of the sea. Their lives depended on it for trade, travel, and war, yet they also feared it as a realm that could turn deadly without warning. In Poseidon, they personified this danger, creating a god whose temperament matched the waves themselves. Sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, but never fully trustworthy. He was called the Earthshaker, and the name was not merely poetic. Earthquakes were explained as his wrath, the trembling of the ground under the strike of his trident. To live in his world was to accept that solid ground was never truly stable, and that the ocean could never be fully mastered. The myths did not hide this reality. Instead, they exaggerated it, turning Poseidon into the embodiment of a universe that treated human lives as fragile playthings. Much like his brother Zeus, Poseidon was notorious for pursuing mortals and nymphs in ways that today read less like divine romance and more like divine assault. The myths tell of him chasing Demeter when she sought to avoid him, forcing her to turn into a mare to escape. Poseidon, undeterred, transformed himself into a stallion and pursued her anyway. From this union came the horse Arion, a reminder that even the noblest animal in Greek imagination was born of violence and desperation. Other tales describe his relentless pursuit of nymphs and mortals, women who had little chance of escaping a god whose authority encompassed sea and earth alike. These stories, framed as myth, speak to a larger truth the Greeks acknowledged, that power does not respect boundaries. Just as the sea cannot be fenced, so too Poseidon could not be contained. His wrath was not limited to individuals. Entire cities bore the brunt of his anger when they dared to cross him. A well-known example is the city of Troy. Poseidon had once helped build its walls at the command of Zeus, only to be cheated of his due reward by King Laomedon. In response, Poseidon sent a sea monster to ravage the coast and demanded the sacrifice of the king's daughter. This was not justice in any recognizable form, but vengeance that punished not only the guilty, but the innocent, spreading terror across the land. The gods were not interested in fairness. They were interested in respect. And in Poseidon's case, respect was demanded through fear. Perhaps the most famous example of Poseidon's spite is found in the Odyssey, the epic tale of Odysseus's return from Troy. Odysseus, clever and boastful, blinded Poseidon's son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, in order to escape his cave. It was, by human standards, an act of necessity. Either blind the monster or be devoured. By divine standards, however, it was an unforgivable insult. From that moment onward, Poseidon harried Odysseus across the seas, thwarting his every attempt to return home. Storms wrecked his ships, waves cast him back from shore, and each time he glimpsed safety, Poseidon intervened to prolong his torment. What should have been a journey of weeks stretched into 10 long years, during which Odysseus lost his crew, his wealth, and nearly his mind. The epic makes clear that Odysseus's suffering was not a lesson in morality, but an illustration of divine grudge-holding. Poseidon was less interested in justice than in making an example of anyone who dared challenge him or his kin. The myths also describe Poseidon competing with other gods for patronage of cities, revealing his deep insecurity and pettiness. The most famous contest was for Athens, where Poseidon offered the gift of a saltwater spring or, in some versions, the horse. Athena, his rival, offered the olive tree, a symbol of peace and prosperity. The citizens chose her gift, and Athena became the patron of the city. Poseidon, humiliated, lashed out by flooding the Attic plain in retaliation. The story captures his character in miniature, generous when he wished to be, but incapable of losing gracefully, always ready to inflict pain on those who dared prefer another's favour. His divine authority was fragile, easily wounded, and mortals were left to pay the price for his pride. It is telling that in myths of collective destruction, Poseidon is often present. When Zeus decided to flood the world, to destroy humanity, Poseidon joined him, his waves rising alongside the thunder of his brother's storms. The deluge wiped out nearly everyone, sparing only a handful of survivors. For mortals, this was not an allegory of renewal, as it might be in other traditions. It was a stark reminder that the gods could and would erase entire populations without hesitation, their quarrels and disappointments spilling over into mass catastrophe. Poseidon, as the master of floods, became the perfect symbol of this arbitrary devastation. A god who could wash away lives as casually as a wave erases footprints in sand. For sailors, the rituals devoted to Poseidon were acts of appeasement, not of devotion. Before voyages, offerings were cast into the waves. Wine, animals, even prayers scribbled and floated on fragile boats, anything to gain his favour, or at least to avoid his wrath. To neglect him was unthinkable. The sea was his realm, and to step onto it without first acknowledging him was to court disaster. Yet the irony is that even with sacrifices, there was no guarantee of safety. The myths are filled with stories of pious sailors and entire fleets undone by sudden storms, their prayers unanswered, their ships dashed against the rocks. Poseidon accepted offerings, but he did not promise fairness. Like the sea itself, he remained capricious. The Greeks did not tell these stories because they believed Poseidon was admirable. They told them because they recognized in him the terrifying truth of their world. Earthquakes struck without warning. Storms rose suddenly on calm waters. Entire harvests could be ruined by floods. To personify these forces as the moods of a god was less about reverence than about giving shape to chaos. In Poseidon, they saw not a wise guardian, but the embodiment of nature's indifference, a reminder that no amount of human effort could master the elements. His myths carried the same weary lesson. Existence was fragile, and the gods ensured it remained so. Yet Poseidon was not without his moments of grandeur. He was, after all, the father of horses, credited with giving humanity one of its most valued companions in war and travel. His trident was a potent symbol of authority, feared by gods and mortals alike. But even these achievements are undercut by the larger pattern of his myths. Horses were born from his pursuit of Demeter, hardly a noble beginning, and the trident was often used not to preserve order, but to smash it. His greatness was inseparable from his destructiveness, and his gifts were rarely free of menace. If Zeus embodied the corruption of authority within the household, and Hera embodied the bitterness of betrayal, Poseidon embodied the terror of the natural world itself. He was the god who made it clear that humans lived at the mercy of forces they could neither predict nor control. His wrath could sink a fleet, flatten a city, or trap a man on the sea for a decade, all because of a slight, real, or imagined. To worship Poseidon was not to find comfort in divine protection. It was to acknowledge helplessness in the face of overwhelming power. And yet even this picture of divine brutality was not the whole of Greek religion. For the Greeks also revered Athena, goddess of wisdom, whose olive tree seemed to offer a more civilized alternative to Poseidon's floods and storms. But as her myths reveal, civilization did not mean kindness, and wisdom did not mean mercy. If Poseidon punished with brute destruction, Athena punished with the precision of logic. And her victims learned that to cross her was no less perilous than to anger the Earthshaker. Athena's entry into the world is one of the strangest stories in all of Greek mythology, which is saying something in a tradition already overflowing with bizarre births, grotesque transformations, and questionable family arrangements. The myth tells us that Zeus, ever plagued by anxieties about succession, swallowed his first wife Metis, the goddess of cunning thought. This was not a romantic gesture, nor an act of affection, but a precautionary one. An oracle had warned that Metis would bear children who could surpass Zeus in power, and rather than risk another overthrow, like the one he had inflicted on his own father, Zeus chose to consume her whole. Yet swallowing Metis did not prevent the birth of a child. Instead, it ensured that when Athena emerged, she did so directly from Zeus himself. In the tale most often told, Zeus developed an unbearable headache, so severe that it split his skull. From this fissure leapt Athena, fully armed and fully grown, clad in shining armour and wielding a spear. It is a myth that embodies both absurdity and symbolism. The goddess of wisdom, born not from nurturing or gestation, but from an act of violence, as though thought itself was a wound. This peculiar birth set the tone for Athena's reputation. She was celebrated as the goddess of wisdom, strategy, and civilization, often portrayed as a dignified counterweight to the chaos of her fellow Olympians. Cities built temples to her, most famously the Parthenon in Athens, and her image adorned coins and shields as a mark of protection. Yet when one examines the myths in detail, the veneer of wisdom begins to crack. Athena's wisdom was not compassion, nor a higher sense of justice. It was strategy stripped of empathy, reason wielded as a weapon, and logic enforced without mercy. Her birth from a skull should be taken quite literally. She embodied intellect divorced from the softer qualities of understanding. For mortals who crossed her, wisdom did not appear as guidance, but as punishment. The myth of Arachne illustrates this cruelty with particular clarity. Arachne was a mortal woman of great talent, gifted in the art of weaving. Her skill became so renowned that she dared to boast she was equal to Athena herself, who was also the patroness of weaving. For this arrogance, the goddess confronted her directly, disguised at first as an old woman to warn her against pride. When Arachne refused to retract her claim, Athena revealed herself and demanded a contest. The two set to work creating tapestries of dazzling complexity. Athena wove scenes exalting the power of the gods, while Arachne wove scenes exposing their crimes, the betrayals, the assaults, the humiliations that the Olympians inflicted upon mortals. By every account, Arachne's work was flawless, a triumph of artistry and truth. Faced with this, Athena did not reward her or concede defeat. Instead, she destroyed the tapestry in rage and struck Arachne. Overcome with despair, the mortal hanged herself, only for Athena to transform her into a spider, condemned to weave forever. Here, the so-called goddess of wisdom revealed her true nature, incapable of tolerating challenge, blind to truth, and quick to crush those whose skill or honesty threatened her authority. Wisdom in her hands was indistinguishable from arrogance enforced by power. The Greeks themselves seemed to recognize the ambivalence in Athena's character. She was often invoked as a protector of cities, yet her protection came with a price. During the Trojan War, she sided firmly with the Greeks, not out of compassion or justice, but out of personal grievance. When Paris, the Trojan prince, judged Aphrodite more beautiful than her in a divine contest, Athena swore vengeance against Troy. From that slight, an entire city's fate was sealed. She guided Greek warriors, lent them strategies, and tipped battles in their favour. When Achilles fought, Athena stood by him. When Odysseus plotted, she whispered in his ear. Her interventions were decisive, but they were also merciless. Troy was not destroyed because it was wicked, but because a goddess felt insulted. This was wisdom, weaponized as pettiness, strategy deployed to annihilate. Mortals, trapped in the conflict, bore the consequences of what amounted to divine vanity. Athena's role in war underscores her paradox. She was not the bloodthirsty chaos of Ares, who embodied brute violence. She represented the logic of battle, the discipline of planning, the efficiency of killing without passion. Yet this very detachment made her terrifying. Ares might be mocked for his failures, but Athena rarely failed. Her strategies worked, and her calm approach made slaughter more effective. For mortals, to fight under her guidance was to glimpse victory, but it was a victory drenched in blood, calculated without hesitation. Wisdom, in her mythology, was not gentle guidance but a sharpened spear, a reminder that intellect without compassion is as lethal as raw rage. Even outside the battlefield, Athena could be merciless. She punished those who offended her symbols or her sanctity. When Tiresias accidentally saw her bathing, she did not forgive his innocent mistake. she struck him blind, a punishment that condemned him to darkness for life. Only later did she grant him the gift of prophecy, a consolation that did not erase the cruelty of the original act. To the Greeks, this story reminded them that the gods were never interested in intent. Offense was offense, whether deliberate or accidental, and punishment was inevitable. Athena might have been the goddess of reason, but her logic was cold, unyielding, and indifferent to circumstance. Despite these stories, mortals worshipped Athena fervently. The Athenians in particular built their civic identity around her, naming their city after her, and crowning her with festivals like the Panathenea. Her olive tree was celebrated as a gift of prosperity and peace, a contrast to Poseidon's floods and storms. Yet even here, the irony lingers. The olive tree was a symbol of cultivation, of order imposed on the land, of long-term patience. But it was also a reminder of her victory in a contest, a reminder that Poseidon's defeat had come with humiliation and disaster. The Athenians may have praised her gift, but beneath their admiration was the recognition that she, like all the gods, ruled through rivalry and conflict. Civilization was not the triumph of peace, it was the triumph of one god's strategy over another's fury. The myths of Athena reveal a broader truth about Greek religion. The qualities the gods embodied were never simple virtues. Wisdom was not kindness. Justice was not fairness. Protection was not safety. Athena, born from a skull, embodied the reality that intellect divorced from compassion becomes its own form of cruelty. Her stories were not moral lessons in how to be wise, but warnings of what happens when power and intellect combine without restraint. Mortals who admired her gifts knew this. They prayed to her not because she was merciful, but because she was effective, and effectiveness mattered more than morality in a world governed by capricious deities. When we step back and consider Athena, alongside her siblings, the pattern is difficult to ignore. Zeus ruled through lust and fear. Hera ruled through jealousy and revenge. Poseidon ruled through violence and natural disaster. Athena ruled through intellect sharpened into punishment. Each of them carried the trappings of greatness, but each inflicted suffering on mortals who had little say in their quarrels. To live under their gaze was to accept that every divine gift carried a hidden cost, every blessing was edged with danger, and every act of worship was less about admiration than about survival. It is tempting to imagine that among the gods, someone might embody beauty without cruelty, light without destruction, or art without vengeance. Yet even those deities most often associated with harmony and radiance proved as dangerous as the rest. Of the many children Zeus produced, few seemed at first glance more admirable than Apollo and Artemis, the radiant twins born to Leto. Apollo embodied light, music, prophecy, and healing, while Artemis ruled over the hunt, the wilderness, and the protection of maidens. Together, they represented order, purity, and a kind of divine refinement that seemed to set them apart from the chaos of their kin. Statues of Apollo depicted him as the ideal of youthful beauty, calm and perfectly proportioned, while Artemis appeared as a huntress, swift and untouchable, a vision of chaste authority. For mortals, these gods might have seemed to offer something gentler than the lusts of Zeus, the bitterness of Hera, or the violent seas of Poseidon. Yet the myths themselves quickly dismantle this illusion. Apollo and Artemis were not benevolent lights in a dark pantheon. They were, if anything, perfection sharpened into cruelty, their beauty concealing a readiness to punish with terrifying precision. Apollo in particular was a figure whose gifts often carried lethal consequences. Though celebrated as the god of healing, he was equally the god of plague. The Iliad opens with a reminder of this duality. Angered by the Greeks' mistreatment of his priest, Apollo sent arrows of pestilence into their camp, and men dropped dead in droves until their leaders made amends. The idea that music, prophecy, and medicine belong to the same God who could unleash devastating disease shows just how precarious divine favour was imagined to be. To worship Apollo was to acknowledge that health and death came from the same hand, that beauty could mask a plague bringer, and that even the most civilized of gods might turn lethal at a whim. His arrows were said to fly silently and strike without warning, a poetic way of describing sickness, but also a chilling reminder that divine punishment was invisible until it was too late. The myths also reveal Apollo's competitive streak, a feature that often translated into cruelty. His musical contest with Marsyas is one of the most disturbing examples. Marsyas, a psalter, discovered a flute once discarded by Athena and played it with great skill. Emboldened, he challenged Apollo to a contest of music. The competition was fierce, with judges unable to decide a clear victor, until Apollo demanded that each contestant play while singing at the same time. Marsyas, of course, could not manage such a feat on the flute, and Apollo claimed victory. Winning was not enough for the god of music, however. As punishment for daring to challenge him, Apollo flayed Marsyas alive, peeling the skin from his body while the satyr screamed. The myth is not subtle. Mortals who aspire too high, who dare to rival perfection, are destroyed. The story does not celebrate Apollo's artistry. It highlights his pettiness, his inability to tolerate competition, and the cruelty that lurked beneath his golden image. Artemis, for her part, was no gentler. As goddess of the hunt and protector of chastity, she punished with an absolutism that allowed no space for forgiveness. One of her most famous myths is that of Actaeon, a hunter who stumbled upon Artemis while she was bathing. The encounter was accidental, but in divine logic, intent did not matter. For the crime of seeing her unclothed, Artemis transformed him into a stag, and his own hounds tore him apart. The lesson is as blunt as it is merciless. To cross the goddess, even unwittingly, was to invite a fate worse than death. For the Greeks, this story reinforced the precariousness of mortal existence. Even a moment of chance could provoke divine destruction, and no amount of innocence could save you. Artemis's purity was not protection. It was a blade, swift and unforgiving. Perhaps the most infamous tale involving the twins is that of Niobe, Queen of Thebes. Niobe was a mortal woman, blessed with many children, and in her pride she mocked Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis, for bearing only two. It was a simple insult, born of arrogance and perhaps envy, but in the world of myth, no slight went unanswered. Apollo and Artemis descended upon Niobe's household and slaughtered her offspring. One by one, her sons and daughters fell under their arrows until none remained. Some versions allow a single child to survive, others, none at all. Niobe herself was struck dumb with grief, weeping until the gods turned her into stone. The myth is one of the most chilling in Greek tradition. A boast uttered in a moment of pride resulted in the annihilation of an entire family, not through chance or war, but through the deliberate, calculated cruelty of gods who could not bear to see their mother insulted. The morale is not that humility is virtuous. The morale is that mortals must tread in constant fear, for even words spoken in jest could bring divine slaughter. What makes the myths of Apollo and Artemis particularly unsettling is their precision. Unlike Poseidon, whose floods or quakes devastated indiscriminately, the twins struck with exact aim. Apollo's arrows of plague found their targets. Artemis's punishments were tailored to the specific insult. Their cruelty had the efficiency of perfection, and this made it all the more terrifying. To live under their gaze was to know that the smallest misstep would not be overlooked, and that the punishment would be exact. fitting in its logic, yet monstrous in its consequence. Beauty and symmetry did not soften them. They intensified the horror by framing it in elegance. This duality of light and death, music and plague, chastity and slaughter was not lost on the Greeks. They revered Apollo and Artemis with festivals, temples, and hymns, but their devotion was born as much from fear as from admiration. Apollo's oracle at Delphi was one of the most important religious centres in Greece, a place where mortals sought guidance for their future. Yet the answers given were famously ambiguous, riddled with double meanings that could destroy as easily as they could guide. The god of prophecy did not offer clarity. He offered riddles that left mortals uncertain until events played out, often to their ruin. Artemis, meanwhile, was invoked to protect women in childbirth, yet her presence in myth reminded all that she could just as easily bring death in that liminal space. To call on these deities was to gamble, to hope that their perfection might fall in your favour, even as you knew it could as easily destroy you. In this way, the twins embodied the paradox of Greek religion itself. The gods were not moral exemplars. They were not guides toward virtue. They were forces of nature, power personified, both beautiful and terrible. Apollo and Artemis appeared radiant, yet beneath that radiance lay the same indifference to human suffering that defined the entire pantheon. Their myths did not promise justice. They promised that the world was dangerous, that beauty and cruelty were inseparable, and that perfection itself could be lethal. As siblings, Apollo and Artemis also represented a rare case of divine unity. They worked in concert, punishing Niobe together, defending their mother together, embodying a seamless cooperation that made their wrath even more formidable. This stands in sharp contrast to other divine pairs, whose relationships were marked by conflict, betrayal, or humiliation. Apollo and Artemis punished with a cold symmetry, two sides of the same coin, their harmony making them all the more efficient as executioners of divine will. If Zeus and Hera embodied dysfunction, and Poseidon embodied uncontrollable rage, the twins embodied the horror of perfection, a reminder that cruelty can be most dangerous when it is precise and coordinated. From here, the myths moved to a very different kind of pairing. Not radiant twins who worked in harmony, but brothers defined by failure and mockery. If Apollo and Artemis show how gods could destroy with beauty and balance, Ares and Hephaestus show how gods could humiliate and be humiliated. Their myths brimming not with perfection, but with dysfunction. Ares stands out as the most unpopular of all the Olympian gods. This is remarkable, considering that most of the pantheon delighted in acts of cruelty and folly, yet somehow Ares managed to attract a degree of disdain that set him apart. He was the god of war, and one might expect that in a culture so often engaged in battle, such a god would command respect. Yet the myths paint him not as a noble warrior, but as a figure of bloodlust, recklessness, and humiliating defeat. Even Zeus, who was hardly a model of restraint, admitted his disgust for Ares, calling him the most hateful of his children. To mortals, he represented the chaos of the battlefield, not the glory of victory or the honour of courage. His presence in a myth rarely signalled triumph. More often, it signalled slaughter without purpose, followed quickly by ridicule from gods and mortals alike. Part of the reason for Ares' disrepute was that he embodied the sheer destruction of war without its redeeming qualities. Athena, for instance, was also associated with battle, but she represented strategy, discipline, and intelligence. She planned campaigns and rewarded cunning. Ares, by contrast, was violence made flesh, charging into conflict without thought or reason, delighting in the clash of arms for its own sake. He was less a general than a berserker, less a leader than a blunt weapon. For the Greeks, who valued order even in war, Ares represented the side of battle that was terrifying rather than admirable. The chaos of bloodshed, the screaming of the wounded, and the collapse of discipline. It is little wonder that in Homer's epics, Ares is often wounded, fleeing, or defeated, a god who embodies the very futility of the wars he claims to rule. One of the most telling aspects of Ares' mythology is how frequently he is humiliated. In the Iliad, for example, he enters the battle in fury, only to be struck down by the mortal hero Diomedes, who is guided by Athena. The spectacle of the god of war, injured and forced to retreat from a human fighter, reveals how little esteem he held in the mythic imagination. Later, Ares runs crying to Zeus like a child, complaining of his wounds, which only earns him scorn. To depict the god of war in such a light was no accident. The Greeks understood that war was not glorious, but costly and demeaning, and in Ares they created a deity who reminded them that the frenzy of bloodlust leads only to defeat. Ares' personal life was no less humiliating. His most famous affair was with Aphrodite, the goddess of love, who was married to Hephaestus, the smith of the gods. The relationship might have seemed enviable, love paired with war, beauty with violence, but the outcome was another myth of ridicule. Hephaestus, aware of their adultery, set a cunning trap. He forged an invisible net of unbreakable chains and set it upon his bed. When Ares and Aphrodite lay together, the net closed around them, binding them in a humiliating tangle. Hephaestus then called the other gods to witness the spectacle. One by one, they arrived to laugh at the entangled pair, mocking the god of war and the goddess of beauty for their indiscretion. The scene is one of the most memorable examples of divine comedy. Yet beneath the humour lies a pointed message. Even the god of battle could be trapped and mocked, his power reduced to farce. Hephaestus himself was no stranger to ridicule. He was the only Olympian god portrayed as physically deformed, described as lame or crippled. Accounts differ as to why. Some say he was born weak and cast from Olympus by Hera, ashamed of him. Others claim Zeus hurled him down in anger during a quarrel. Either way, Hephaestus grew up maimed, an outsider even among the gods. Yet while Ares embodied brute force without intelligence, Hephaestus embodied intelligence without beauty. He was a craftsman, the forger of divine weapons, armour and palaces. The paradox of his myths is that he supplied the Olympians with their greatest tools of power, yet was never respected for it. He could create thunderbolts for Zeus, armour for Achilles, or chains strong enough to bind gods themselves. But he remained the butt of jokes, the limping smith whose deformity overshadowed his genius. The myth of his trap for Ares and Aphrodite reveals this paradox perfectly. Hephaestus, mocked for his weakness, used his skill to humiliate those who scorned him. The gods laughed at the spectacle, but one can imagine Hephaestus smiling bitterly. He had no beauty, no physical strength, and no respect, but he had intellect, and intellect could wound pride more deeply than any spear. The scene also highlights the dysfunction of Olympus as a whole. Here were the gods of war and love, entangled in adultery, humiliated not by justice but by a practical joke. Here was the god of the forge, despised and deformed, finding vindication not through admiration but through ridicule. The pantheon, celebrated in marble and temple, was in reality a collection of rivalries and humiliations more suited to a farce than to worship. Despite his mockery, Hephaestus was indispensable. He created the chains that bound Prometheus, the armour that allowed heroes to triumph, the palaces that glorified Olympus. His craftsmanship was flawless, his utility undeniable, yet he never escaped the stigma of his lameness. the Greeks told his stories with both admiration and cruelty, recognizing his genius while emphasizing his deformity, as though to remind themselves that usefulness does not guarantee dignity. He was tolerated, not celebrated, and his marriage to Aphrodite was less a union of love than a cosmic joke. Beauty was paired with ugliness, love with ridicule, and the result was predictable: betrayal and humiliation. Ares and Hephaestus taken together show two sides of weakness in the pantheon. Ares was strong yet foolish, feared on the battlefield but despised for his failures. Hephaestus was brilliant yet broken, capable of extraordinary creations yet never free from mockery. Both illustrate that divinity did not guarantee dignity, and that even gods could be defined by dysfunction. For mortals, these myths offered little comfort. If the god of war could be wounded by a man, and the god of craftsmanship could be thrown from the heavens, what hope was there for ordinary people? The gods were not paragons. They were cautionary tales reminding humanity that power and weakness often coexisted, and that ridicule was the constant companion of both. The contrast between Ares and Hephaestus also highlights the breadth of Greek imagination. War was not only bloodlust, but also strategy. Craftsmanship was not only utility, but also cunning. Yet both were corrupted by the flaws of their divine patrons. Ares turned war into frenzy, while Hephaestus turned genius into mockery. Mortals who prayed to them did so with a mixture of necessity and unease. Ares was invoked before battle, but never admired. Hephaestus was invoked for skill and craft, but rarely loved. In both cases, worship was transactional, a recognition of power without affection. Ultimately, the stories of Ares and Hephaestus reinforce the central theme of Greek mythology. The gods were not moral guides, nor were they dignified rulers. They were flawed, petty, and often ridiculous, their grandeur undermined by their own behaviour. Ares could not win respect, and Hephaestus could not escape humiliation. Their myths serve not as lessons in virtue, but as reminders of the absurdity of divine authority. If even war and craft could be reduced to jokes, then nothing on Olympus was sacred. From here, the stories of the gods take yet another turn. If Ares embodied the chaos of battle, and Hephaestus the bitterness of ridicule, Dionysus embodied something stranger still: the madness of ecstasy, the frenzy of wine, and the dissolution of all dignity. In him, the pretenses of order and authority fall away entirely, leaving only delirium and dismemberment. To move from Ares and Hephaestus to Dionysus is to leave the realm of war and craft for the realm of madness, where the gods reveal not their weakness but their most terrifying power, the ability to dissolve the boundaries of reason itself. Among the Olympian gods, none blurred the line between joy and horror more than Dionysus. He was the god of wine, of ecstasy, of liberation from ordinary restraints. At first glance, this seems like a rare reprieve in the grim catalogue of Greek mythology. After all, who would not prefer a deity of festivals, vineyards, and celebration to one of storms, plagues, or jealous punishments? Statues and plays often present Dionysus as a figure of youthful beauty, crowned with ivy, holding a cup of wine, surrounded by revellers. Yet, as always with the Greek gods, the surface deceives. Dionysus did not simply grant joy, he dissolved the boundaries of reason, blurred the edges of sanity, and drove his worshippers into frenzies where laughter and terror were indistinguishable. His blessings were indistinguishable from curses, his gifts indistinguishable from ruin. In him the Greeks imagined the most unsettling truth of all, that delight itself could destroy. The cult of Dionysus was unlike any other. His followers, known as Maenads, were women who abandoned their households, to join him in the wild. Clad in fawn skins, crowned with ivy, carrying thyrsi, rods tipped with pine cones, they roamed mountains and forests in ecstatic processions. To outsiders, it might have seemed like harmless revelry, drunken celebration stretched into ritual. But the myths emphasize that these gatherings were not tame. They were wild, violent, and unstoppable. In their frenzy, the Maenads were said to tear apart animals with their bare hands, feasting on raw flesh as though possessed by the god himself. In some stories, they did the same to men who had the misfortune to encounter them. To join Dionysus's retinue was to abandon restraint, to let go of reason and morality, and to embrace a madness that could at any moment turn joyous song into dismemberment. The story of Pentheus, king of Thebes, illustrates this paradox with brutal clarity. Pentheus resisted the cult of Dionysus, viewing it as a threat to order. He attempted to suppress the new god's worship, imprisoning him and mocking his influence. But Dionysus was not so easily restrained. Through trickery, he lured Pentheus into disguising himself as a woman so he could spy on the Maenads. The king, blinded by curiosity and arrogance, agreed. When he crept into the hills dressed in female garb, he was discovered by the frenzied women. Mistaking him for a lion, or perhaps simply unable to distinguish through their madness, they tore him apart, limb from limb. His own mother, Agave, led the attack, carrying his head on a thyrsus in triumph, only realizing too late that she had murdered her son. The myth is grotesque, but its lesson is unmistakable. Dionysus did not merely punish his enemies with death. He punished them by dissolving the bonds of family, sanity, and identity. His madness spread like wine spilled on the earth, staining everything it touched. What is striking about these stories is how Dionysus's punishments are always framed as transformations of joy into horror. Wine loosens inhibitions, yet in his cult it became the gateway to frenzy. Dancing liberated the body, yet in his rituals it became violent convulsion. Even familial love, the bond between mother and son, was inverted into its opposite under his influence. The Greeks did not imagine him as a god of steady intoxication, but of extremes. Bliss tipping suddenly into terror, celebration tipping suddenly into bloodshed. In Dionysus, they confronted the truth that joy itself can be dangerous, that liberation is not always freedom, but sometimes the destruction of all boundaries. The Greeks themselves seem to have been ambivalent about Dionysus. His festivals were some of the most elaborate, involving parades, masks, and theatrical performances. Greek drama itself grew out of Dionysian ritual, proof that creativity and culture could emerge from his chaotic worship. Yet even these artistic legacies carried the memory of his darker side. The plays performed in his honour often depicted the fragility of human life, the inevitability of downfall, the violence lurking beneath the veneer of civilization. To celebrate Dionysus was to acknowledge both the power of creativity and the inevitability of collapse. He was not a god who offered stability. He was a god who reminded mortals that stability was always an illusion. The ambiguity of Dionysus also extended to his identity. In some traditions, he was considered a latecomer to Olympus, a disruptive outsider whose worship spread from foreign lands. This foreignness made him both alluring and unsettling. He was welcomed in times of celebration, yet feared in times of crisis, for his arrival always meant upheaval. In some myths he was twice born, first from Semele, who was incinerated by Zeus's divine radiance, and then from Zeus's own thigh, where the unborn child was sewn to safety. Such strangeness only reinforced his association with liminality, with the blurring of categories, with being both inside and outside. both saviour and destroyer. Mortals could never fully grasp him, and perhaps that was the point. He represented everything that defied neat explanation, everything that undermined the fragile boundaries humans relied on. Another telling myth is that of King Lycurgus, who opposed the worship of Dionysus. In some versions, Lycurgus attempted to imprison the god and his followers, only to be driven into madness himself. He mistook his own son for a vine and hacked him to death with an axe, believing he was uprooting the threat. In other versions, he slaughtered his horses in a frenzy, again mistaking them for something else. The punishment was not just death, but delusion, the stripping away of reason until murder became indistinguishable from pruning. Eventually, the land itself withered under his crime, and the gods decreed his destruction. Once again, Dionysus punished not by striking down his enemies directly, but by unravelling their minds, leaving them to destroy what they loved most. It is easy to see why the Greeks treated Dionysus with caution. His cult was allowed, but only in controlled bursts, during festivals where the normal rules of life were suspended. For a few days, order gave way to revelry, hierarchy gave way to masquerade, and restraint gave way to intoxication. Yet the boundaries were always restored afterward. To let Dionysus rule perpetually would have meant the end of civilization. The god of wine and ecstasy was acknowledged, honoured, and even celebrated, but never trusted. His worship was both necessary and dangerous, a pressure valve for a society that knew repression could not be total, but also knew madness could not be permanent. What the myths of Dionysus emphasize most is the paradox of liberation. He offered freedom, but it was freedom that stripped away identity. He offered ecstasy, but it was ecstasy that ended in dismemberment. He offered creativity, but it was creativity born of chaos. For mortals, his presence was both gift and threat. To resist him was to invite madness, but to embrace him too fully was to risk losing oneself entirely. He embodied the unsettling truth that joy and horror are not opposites, but neighbours, separated only by the thinnest of walls. In the end, Dionysus was not an exception to the cruelty of the Greek gods. He was simply another form of it, disguised in ivy and wine, rather than thunderbolts or floods. His cult may have produced songs and plays, but it also produced torn flesh and ruined families. The Greeks understood that joy could be as destructive as anger, and that the gods offered no safe refuge, not even in celebration. To lift a cup to Dionysus was to risk spilling blood as well as wine, to invite both inspiration and insanity. His was a divinity of contradictions, and mortals caught in his orbit rarely escaped unscathed. And so, even in joy, the gods inflicted horror. The laughter of festivals carried the echo of screams. The sweetness of wine carried the memory of madness. In Dionysus, the Greeks dramatized the danger of ecstasy itself, and in doing so, they prepared the ground for yet another tale of divine cruelty, one not born of frenzy, but of grief. Few of the myths of the Greek pantheon strike so directly at the heart of human suffering as the tale of Demeter and Persephone. It is a story that begins, as so many do, with abduction and violation. Persephone, the daughter of Demeter and Zeus, was gathering flowers in a meadow when the earth suddenly split open. From the chasm emerged Hades, the ruler of the underworld, who seized the maiden and dragged her into his realm. This was not a marriage proposal in any recognizable sense, but a kidnapping sanctioned, if not orchestrated, by Zeus himself, who consented to the union without consulting either his daughter or her mother. The image of Persephone vanishing into the earth is one of the most haunting in Greek myth, for it captures the fragility of human existence. One moment the world is filled with sunlight and blossoms, and the next it swallows you whole, leaving only silence behind. Demeter's grief at the loss of her daughter was immediate and all-consuming. As the goddess of grain and agriculture, she was bound to the fertility of the earth, and her sorrow manifested in the land itself. Crops withered, fields lay barren, and famine spread across the world. The myths tell us that mortals starved, animals perished, and the entire rhythm of life began to falter. It was not simply a mother's grief. It was a cosmic act of mourning that punished humanity for the crimes of the gods. Demeter wandered the earth searching for her child, disguised as a mortal woman, her anguish written across the soil. Everywhere she went, she was offered hospitality, and everywhere she went, the land remained sterile. The message was unavoidable. Until her daughter was restored, no one would eat. The suffering of mortals in this myth is particularly stark because it is not incidental. It is central to the story. The gods quarrelled, and mortals died as a consequence. Crops failed not because of poor weather or human error, but because the divine family could not keep its affairs in order. This is one of the clearest demonstrations in Greek mythology of how little the gods cared for human welfare. They did not intervene to relieve famine. They did not rush to console the starving. Their concern was not for the countless lives withering under Demeter's grief, but for maintaining their own balance of power. In fact, the famine grew so severe that it threatened to extinguish the very sacrifices upon which the gods relied. Only then did Zeus take notice, not out of compassion, but out of self-interest. Without mortals, there would be no worship, no offerings, no smoke rising from altars to sustain divine egos. The gods intervened not to save humanity, but to preserve their own honour. When Hermes was finally sent to the underworld to negotiate Persephone's return, the compromise reached was less a solution than a half-hearted truce. Persephone would spend part of the year with her mother and part with her husband. The myth explains this arrangement with the detail that she had eaten pomegranate seeds in the underworld, binding her to that realm. The number of seeds varies in different versions of the story, but the result is always the same. She is divided between two worlds, never fully free of her abductor. For half the year, she returns to Demeter, and the earth blossoms with joy. For the other half, she descends again to Hades, and Demeter's grief plunges the world into winter. The cycle of the seasons, so natural to us now, was explained by the Greeks as the product of divine cruelty and compromise, a rhythm of fertility and starvation born not of benevolence, but of loss. For mortals, this myth was more than a charming explanation of weather patterns. It was a reminder that their survival hinged on forces utterly beyond their control. Their harvests depended not simply on their labour, but on whether a goddess happened to be grieving. The story acknowledged the reality of famine, which the Greeks knew all too well, but framed it in a way that underscored their helplessness. Crops failed not because of misfortune alone, but because the gods had quarrelled, and mortals were collateral damage. To pray to Demeter was to plead with her not to let her sorrow destroy you. Worship was not thanksgiving. It was bargaining, the desperate hope that her grief might ease long enough for grain to grow. The Eleusinian mysteries, the great cult devoted to Demeter and Persephone, reveal how deeply this myth resonated with Greek society. Initiates to the cult were promised some measure of hope for the afterlife, a rare suggestion of consolation in a religion otherwise devoid of it. Yet even here, the promise was bound up with suffering. To participate was to reenact the mother's grief and the daughter's descent, to relive the starvation of mortals and the despair of the world. Only through ritual lament could one hope for reassurance. The mysteries were not joyful celebrations of abundance. They were acknowledgements that abundance was always fragile, always dependent on the whims of gods, whose own sorrows outweighed the lives of humanity. The indifference of the gods is especially visible in the way the story concludes. Zeus and Hades did not apologize for their role in Persephone's abduction. They did not acknowledge the suffering of mortals who had starved during the famine. Their compromise was practical, designed to restore the cycle of offerings, not to bring justice. Persephone remained bound to her captor, Demeter remained half bereaved, and mortals remained condemned to endure winter each year as a reminder of divine callousness. The myth is not about resolution, it is about endurance, about the acceptance that grief and famine are woven into the fabric of life because the gods chose to make it so. It is worth remembering that the Greeks did not tell these stories as quaint fables. They told them as explanations for the reality they experienced. The sudden blight, the failed harvest, the long winter that emptied storehouses and left fields barren. They knew that starvation came not from moral failing, but from forces beyond their control, and they personified those forces in Demeter's sorrow. To suffer hunger was not to be cursed individually. It was to share in a collective punishment inflicted by powers no human could resist. The myth gave shape to despair, but it did not soften it. It made clear that survival was contingent, fragile, and forever vulnerable to the moods of beings who did not share mortal priorities. The abduction of Persephone and the famine that followed show perhaps more clearly than any other myth the transactional nature of Greek worship. Mortals did not expect love from the gods. They expected indifference at best and cruelty at worst. Their sacrifices and prayers were not expressions of devotion in the modern sense, but of desperation. Worship was a negotiation with beings who had demonstrated again and again that they were willing to let humanity starve. If Demeter could be persuaded through offerings, then perhaps the grain might return. If Persephone could be honoured, perhaps her time above ground would lengthen. The entire rhythm of religion was shaped by this fragile bargain, one in which survival depended on appeasing powers who had already proven themselves indifferent to survival itself. And so, mortals continued to build temples, to pour libations, to slaughter animals in sacrifice, not because they admired their gods, but because they had no choice. The famine in Demeter's myth made that brutally clear. Without worship, without appeasement, the gods could erase humanity as easily as Demeter withheld the harvest. Survival was never guaranteed, and faith was never about trust. It was about endurance under the rule of beings who mistook cruelty for governance and grief for justice. Mortals did not worship because the gods deserved it. They worshipped because, without it, they would die. Greek mythology is filled with grand stories of gods quarrelling, punishing, and humiliating mortals. But those myths did not exist only to be retold around the hearth. They were woven into the daily life of ordinary people who lived with the constant awareness that their survival depended on the unpredictable moods of Olympus. The Greeks did not have the luxury of dismissing their gods as distant or abstract. Every field of barley, every voyage across the sea, every childbirth and festival was overshadowed by the need to honour deities who could as easily ruin as preserve. Religion for them was less an act of devotion than an act of constant appeasement. If the gods were capricious, then mortals had to be cautious, offering food, blood, song, and labour in the hope of deflecting divine wrath. Temples rose across the Greek world, not simply as houses of beauty, but as staging grounds for bargaining. These structures were built with marble, columns, and dazzling decoration, but at their heart they were places where smoke from sacrifices could rise to heaven, carrying with it the scent of burnt flesh and fat. Animals, bulls, sheep, goats, were led to the altars, garlanded and slaughtered, their blood spattering the stones while hymns were sung to mask the brutality. The choicest cuts were burned for the gods, while the community feasted on the rest. To an outsider, it might have looked like a religious celebration, But to those who lived it, the ritual was deeply pragmatic. Sacrifice was a transaction. The gods were given their portion, and in exchange, mortals hoped to be spared misfortune. Festivals reinforced this logic. At the Panathenea in Athens, great processions carried offerings to Athena, culminating in the presentation of a new robe for her statue. At the Dionysia, actors performed tragedies and comedies in honour of Dionysus, both celebrating him and containing his frenzy within the bounds of theatre. The Eleusinian mysteries promised initiates a glimpse of hope in the afterlife by reenacting the sorrow of Demeter and Persephone. Each of these festivals combined community with dread, joy with anxiety. They were elaborate performances to remind both mortals and gods of their respective places. To fail to attend, to neglect a sacrifice, or to disrespect the ritual order was to invite disaster. This fear-based devotion extended into private life. A family might keep a small shrine in their home, offering libations of wine or oil to household gods. Before meals, a portion of food might be set aside for Hestia, goddess of the hearth, whose presence symbolized domestic stability. Travelers poured out offerings to Hermes for safe passage, sailors cast wine into the waves for Poseidon, and women prayed to Artemis for protection during childbirth. These acts were not expressions of affection. They were insurance policies, tiny gestures to acknowledge that divine power lurked in every corner of life. The smallest oversight could be catastrophic. Forget to honour Hermes, and your journey might end in robbery. Neglect Artemis, and childbirth could turn fatal. The gods did not need excuses to punish mortals, but neglect certainly provided them with one. The myths themselves reinforce this precarious relationship. Consider the story of Hippolytus, who devoted himself exclusively to Artemis and refused to honour Aphrodite. For this slight, Aphrodite orchestrated his destruction, causing his stepmother to fall in love with him and eventually bringing about his death. The moral was clear. Worship had to be balanced. Favouring one god over another was dangerous, because the gods were jealous and petty. Mortals were forced to spread their devotion thin, never allowing loyalty to one to appear as insult to another. The pantheon was less a harmonious family than a collection of rival siblings, and mortals had to play the role of anxious diplomats, appeasing each deity enough to survive. The transactional nature of Greek religion is particularly striking when contrasted with later religious traditions that emphasized love, morality, or salvation. The Greek gods did not ask for moral purity. They did not demand compassion toward one's neighbour. They did not care about personal virtue in the way later traditions would define it. What they demanded was respect, offerings, and the acknowledgement of their superiority. A thief could honour Hermes and prosper. A murderer could sacrifice to Ares and hope for protection. The gods were not moral teachers, but cosmic patrons, offering favour only to those who remembered their due. Forgetfulness, not wickedness, was the gravest sin. This system placed mortals in a constant state of negotiation. Every storm, every illness, every bad harvest could be interpreted as divine displeasure. Communities devised elaborate rituals of atonement, sacrificing more animals, pouring out more libations, building grander temples, all in the hope of restoring balance. Yet the myths reminded them repeatedly that there was no guarantee. Even the most pious could be punished. Niobe boasted of her children and saw them slaughtered by Apollo and Artemis. Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia to appease Artemis and gain favourable winds for Troy, only to suffer tragedy later. The lesson was bleak but consistent. Worship was necessary, but it was never sufficient. The gods owed mortals nothing, even in exchange for devotion. For the Greeks, this meant that religion was suffused with both beauty and dread. The sight of a temple gleaming on a hillside was awe-inspiring, yet it was also a reminder of the blood spilled to build it, and the fear that compelled its offerings. Processions with music and garlands might have seemed celebratory, but beneath them lay the knowledge that without such displays, disaster might follow. Every act of worship was double-edged, a moment of community and joy overshadowed by the shadow of divine vengeance. The pervasiveness of this fear is evident in how myths explained natural disasters. An earthquake was not a geological event. It was Poseidon striking the earth in anger. A plague was not an accident of disease. It was Apollo's arrows of pestilence. A drought was not a failure of weather. It was Demeter grieving or withholding in wrath. To live in such a world was to experience nature itself as personal, each calamity understood as the expression of divine displeasure. And if the gods were displeased, then mortals had only one recourse: more offerings, more ritual, more displays of submission. Yet despite the cruelty of the gods, mortals persisted in their worship. They built the Parthenon to Athena, raised altars to Zeus, sacrificed bulls to Poseidon, and prayed to Demeter for fertile fields. They did so not because they admired these deities, but because they had no alternative. To ignore them was to risk destruction. To resist them was to invite punishment. Survival demanded acknowledgement, however grudging, and so temples filled with worshippers who feared their gods more than they loved them. This dynamic reveals the core of Greek religion. It was not about morality, love, or hope. It was about survival under the rule of beings whose power was absolute and whose behaviour was erratic. The gods were projections of chaos, desire, and violence elevated to divine status because mortals recognised those forces as inescapable. Worship was the vocabulary of fear, the ritualised admission that humanity was powerless before the whims of Olympus. In sacrificing animals, pouring libations, and building temples, mortals were not celebrating benevolent protectors. They were negotiating with capricious tyrants, hoping that today's offering might spare them from tomorrow's disaster. And so the Greeks continued, generation after generation, living under gods who reflected their own chaos and power magnified. The myths that shaped their world offered no salvation and no moral compass. They offered only the reminder that the gods were always watching, always jealous, and always ready to punish. In that realization lay the weary truth of Greek religion. Worship was fear dressed as reverence, and faith was bargaining under duress. The gods may have ruled Olympus, but mortals bore the consequences, and in their endless appeasements, we see the reflection of a society resigned to chaos as the fundamental order of the world. The great paradox of the Greek pantheon is that the gods were at once utterly inhuman and painfully human. They were immortal, powerful, and untouchable, inhabiting a realm far beyond mortal reach. Yet their behaviour was recognisably flawed. They quarrelled, they lusted, they lied, they deceived, and they punished with the kind of arbitrary cruelty that mortals themselves practiced on smaller scales. To describe them as divinities is to acknowledge their power. To describe them as human is to acknowledge their pettiness. They were inhuman in scale, but all too human in temperament. For the Greeks who told their stories, this was not a contradiction but a truth. The gods mirrored the world they lived in, a world where rulers often acted without accountability, where strength determined justice, and where survival depended more on appeasing the powerful than on expecting fairness. Myth made this mirror explicit. Zeus, king of the gods, was not a model of noble leadership, but a despot whose lust and insecurity poisoned his household. Hera, queen of Olympus, was not a symbol of familial harmony, but of jealousy and revenge. Poseidon was not a stable protector of the seas, but a violent force of earthquakes and floods, demanding respect through terror. Athena was not a gentle guardian of wisdom, but a strategist who crushed mortals who dared to rival her. Apollo and Artemis embodied beauty turned cruel, while Ares embodied violence without strategy, and Hephaestus genius without dignity. Even Dionysus, who seemed at first to promise joy, revealed that ecstasy could dissolve into madness and death. The entire pantheon, taken as a whole, reflected a society that recognized power as both necessary and destructive, and that understood cruelty not as an aberration but as a constant. To worship these gods was to acknowledge that they were not better than mortals, but more powerful. They did not rise above human flaws. They amplified them. Every lust, every jealousy, every vanity was played out on Olympus at divine scale, with mortals swept up as collateral. In this way, the pantheon served as a distorted mirror, showing humanity its own reflection, magnified, exaggerated, and stripped of restraint. The stories did not promise that gods would teach mortals how to live virtuously. They promised that mortals could expect from the gods the same betrayals and injustices they experienced from one another, only without hope of recourse. The gods were not alien. They were familiar, which made them even more terrifying. Consider the way myths treated hospitality, or xenia, the sacred duty of guest friendship. Zeus was supposed to protect it, punishing those who violated its rules. Yet he himself routinely violated trust, deceiving mortals for his own pleasure. The lesson was not that mortals should act morally because the gods demanded it. The lesson was that mortals should uphold the rules of society to avoid chaos, even while knowing the gods themselves would not follow them. Similarly, the gods embodied violence in ways that reflected human realities. Cities were sacked because of the whims of Aphrodite and Athena, just as they might be sacked in human wars because of pride and greed. The gods dramatized what mortals already knew. Power was fickle, alliances were fragile, and justice was nowhere to be found. The myths also reveal how the Greeks understood desire. Sexual conquest was a recurring theme of divine behavior, particularly Zeus's endless affairs. These were not celebrated as romantic, but acknowledged as destructive, leaving women abandoned and children persecuted. In reflecting human behavior, the myths did not excuse it so much as normalize it. The gods behaved in ways mortals could recognize all too easily, because kings and rulers often behaved in precisely the same fashion. The difference was that when Zeus seduced or abducted, there was no escape. When Hera persecuted, there was no appeal. The divine simply replicated human cruelty with absolute impunity. Even the gods' victories reflected human anxieties rather than ideals. When Zeus overthrew Cronus, it was not to establish justice, but to secure his own rule. When Athena bested Arachne, it was not to reward skill, but to punish presumption. When Apollo punished Marsyas, it was not to elevate art, but to destroy a rival. These stories show that the Greeks did not imagine a universe governed by morality. They imagined a universe governed by competition, rivalry, and hierarchy. Victory did not prove virtue. It proved only power. Mortals could admire brilliance or cunning, but they understood that those qualities offered no protection from jealousy. To excel was dangerous because excellence invited divine notice, and divine notice was almost always lethal. It is tempting to think of religion as offering guidance or comfort, but Greek religion offered neither in any consistent sense. It did not teach mortals to love one another, nor did it promise forgiveness, nor did it offer an afterlife of salvation for the faithful. The myths were brutally honest in this regard. The afterlife was a shadowy underworld where most souls wandered in gloom, regardless of piety or virtue. Heroes might be remembered, but memory was no guarantee of comfort. The gods did not extend mercy. They extended only the demand for sacrifice. In this sense, the myths were a mirror of mortality itself. Just as humans were subject to chance, accident, and suffering, so too were their fates at the hands of gods. The religious system did not pretend otherwise. The gods also reflected the social order of the Greeks. They were organized as a family, with hierarchies, rivalries, and feuds that mirrored the aristocratic households of mortal society. Zeus was the patriarch, Hera the embittered wife, Athena the loyal strategist, Ares the troublesome son, and so on. Each role exaggerated qualities that mortals recognized in their own families and communities. The pantheon was not an escape from human society, but a distorted dramatization of it, projected into eternity. For mortals, this was both familiar and terrifying. Familiar because they saw in the gods the same dynamics they endured daily. Terrifying because there was no possibility of reform. Human households might change, rulers might die, but the gods remained locked in their dysfunction forever, condemning mortals to live under their endless quarrels. The cruelty of the gods did not make them irrelevant. On the contrary, it made them indispensable. The Greeks knew that to survive, they had to appease forces stronger than themselves, even when those forces mirrored the worst of humanity. The myths did not encourage admiration. They encouraged caution. Mortals who read their own flaws in the gods understood that they had to tread carefully. Just as one might flatter a powerful but dangerous neighbour to avoid insult, so too did one flatter the gods with offerings and prayers. Religion was not affection for the gods, but a ritualized admission of dependence, fear formalized into tradition. The gods were mirrors of humanity, but they were mirrors that revealed the ugliest truths: lust without love, power without restraint, grief without comfort, and vengeance without end. In this light, Greek mythology stands apart from later traditions that attempted to moralize divinity. In Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, gods became moral lawgivers, demanding righteousness and promising salvation. In Buddhism or Hinduism, divine figures offered paths toward enlightenment or escape from suffering. By contrast, the Greek pantheon offered no such consolation. They were not saviors, not guides, not moral exemplars. They were mirrors of the chaos and cruelty of the world, elevated into immortality. To worship them was to acknowledge that power rules, not justice. To tell their stories was to admit that humanity's worst instincts had cosmic endorsement. The gods were immortal, but their immortality did not elevate them above human weakness. It amplified it into eternity. The Greeks lived under a system where their deities reflected their own society back at them, distorted and enlarged. When they prayed not for salvation, but for survival. When they sacrificed not for love, but for appeasement. Their myths taught not the hope of redemption, but the inevitability of chaos. Unlike later religions that sought to comfort mortals with promises of ultimate meaning, the Greeks looked into the mirror of their gods and saw only themselves, petty, jealous, violent, and cruel, magnified until escape was impossible. In the end, the gods offered no salvation. They offered only the weary recognition that chaos is the closest thing to order the world will ever know. When one surveys the myths of the Greek gods from beginning to end, the central theme is impossible to ignore. These beings did not rule the cosmos with wisdom, or with compassion, or with a sense of justice. They ruled with pettiness, with lust, with jealousy, and above all, with raw, unanswerable strength. The power of the gods was not the kind that inspires admiration in the way later religious traditions might expect. It was the kind that forces obedience because there is no alternative. The myths make this point relentlessly. From the mutilation of Uranus, to Cronus devouring his children, to Zeus's endless humiliations of mortals, and his own wife, the Greek pantheon reveals itself as less a collection of benevolent rulers and more a series of cautionary tales about what happens when power is eternal and never checked. The Greeks did not imagine their gods as moral exemplars. They imagined them as reflections of the forces that surrounded them, chaotic, unpredictable, and destructive. It is tempting to think that the Greeks might have resented such gods, or that they would have sought to soften their stories over time, smoothing the rough edges into something more inspiring. Yet what we see instead is the endurance of myths that are brutal, grotesque, and absurd. Cronus swallowing his children was not rewritten as a tender allegory. Hera's endless persecution of innocent mortals was not erased. The Niobe myth, in which a grieving mother watched her children slaughtered, remained central. The Greeks preserved these tales precisely because they captured something essential about existence. Life was not fair. The world was not kind. Suffering was not distributed according to virtue. To live under the gods was to live under power untempered by morality, and the myths reflected this reality with weary honesty. There is a certain irony in how later generations, particularly during the Renaissance, chose to reinterpret the Greek gods. Marble statues were polished until their surfaces gleamed with serene perfection. Painters depicted Zeus as a majestic patriarch, Apollo as radiant beauty, Athena as noble wisdom. The brutality of their stories was often brushed aside in favour of aesthetic admiration. Yet the myths themselves never hid what lay beneath the polished stone. The Greeks knew that Apollo's beauty could be as lethal as plague, that Athena's wisdom could be as cruel as arrogance, that Zeus's kingship was little more than a license for lust. The art softened them, but the stories kept them jagged, as if to remind mortals that beauty and terror are never far apart. The endurance of these myths lies not in their moral clarity, but in their unsettling ambiguity. They do not tell us how to live good lives. They do not promise that good will triumph, or that justice will prevail. Instead, they tell us that chaos is the fundamental order of the world, that power is exercised for its own sake, and that suffering often has no explanation beyond divine whim. The Greeks, in telling these stories, were not deluded about the nature of the universe. They were painfully honest. Unlike later religious traditions that tried to impose a moral framework upon the cosmos, the Greeks accepted that the cosmos had no framework beyond the squabbles of beings stronger than themselves. The result was not comfort, but recognition. The recognition that life is precarious, unfair, and often absurd. Yet this recognition did not strip the myths of their value. On the contrary, it gave them their enduring power. Mortals told these stories not because they offered hope, but because they offered explanation. A famine was not meaningless. It was Demeter's grief. A storm was not random. It was Poseidon's anger. A plague was not accidental. It was Apollo's arrows. These explanations did not comfort, but they gave form to chaos, turning the terrifying unpredictability of the natural world into narratives that could be retold and remembered. The cruelty of the gods was not a solution to suffering, but it at least made suffering intelligible. In that sense, the myths endure because they acknowledge the absurdity of existence without disguising it. The irony is that mortals continued to worship these gods, even as their stories made clear that they did not deserve love. Sacrifices were offered, temples built, festivals celebrated, not out of admiration, but out of necessity. Worship was bargaining, not devotion. To neglect a sacrifice was to invite ruin. To forget a god was to risk destruction. The relationship between mortals and gods was never about affection. It was about fear and survival. The myths did not pretend otherwise. They showed mortals humiliated, punished, torn apart, and driven mad. They showed cities drowned, families destroyed, children consumed. The gods were not moral guardians. They were obstacles, dangers, and threats that had to be managed. And yet, paradoxically, this made them familiar. The Greeks knew rulers who were tyrannical, neighbours who were jealous, families torn by betrayal. The gods simply elevated these human realities into the realm of the eternal. If the gods offered no moral compass, what then did mortals gain from them? Perhaps only the weary recognition that existence itself is not built on fairness, but on power. The gods mirrored this truth so faithfully that to worship them was to acknowledge the absurdity of life. In Zeus's endless affairs, Hera's bitter vengeance, Poseidon's destructive tantrums, Athena's merciless logic, and Dionysus's ecstatic madness, the Greeks saw the same flaws that shaped their own communities. What made the gods different was not virtue, but scale. The flaws were the same. The power to act on them was infinite. In this sense, the gods were not ideals to aspire to, but exaggerations to fear. Later, moralizing traditions might find this bleak. They might prefer to imagine deities as guides, as protectors, as sources of salvation. But the Greeks were more honest. They did not pretend their gods cared. They did not imagine salvation as a possibility. The underworld awaited most souls, shadowy and joyless, regardless of how faithfully they had lived. The gods did not offer eternal rewards for piety or punishments for wickedness. They offered only the demand for sacrifice in exchange for temporary survival. There was no heaven to strive for, no hell to fear, no salvation to hope for. There was only the fragile bargain between mortals and gods, a bargain that could be broken at any time by divine whim. And yet, perhaps this is why the myths still resonate. They do not lie about existence. They do not pretend that suffering can always be explained, or that power can always be restrained. They accept that life is often absurd, that the world is governed by forces beyond reason, and that chaos is the closest thing to justice humanity will ever know. In this acceptance lies a kind of clarity. The Greeks did not ask their gods for salvation because they knew it was not on offer. They asked only to survive another season, another voyage, another day. The myths endure not because they inspire hope, but because they strip away illusion. So when we look back at these stories, what we see is not divine majesty, but divine dysfunction. Not justice, but jealousy. Not morality, but power. The gods of Olympus were not better than mortals, only stronger. And perhaps in some weary way, this is why mortals continued to admire them. Not because they offered a vision of perfection, but because their chaos felt familiar. In the tantrums of Zeus, in the bitterness of Hera, in the vindictiveness of Athena, mortals recognized the same patterns they saw in themselves and in their rulers. The only difference was scale. The curtain closes not on a vision of salvation, but on the ironic realization that the gods were adored not despite their cruelty, but because their cruelty was recognizable. In their chaos, mortals saw a reflection of their own world, and so they worshipped, not out of love, but out of recognition. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. Not a hymn to noble deities seated on thrones of wisdom, but a long trudge through Olympus, where thunderbolts were tantrums, wisdom was cruelty in armour, and joy itself often ended in blood. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.